October 31st, 1994. A routine flight from Indianapolis to Chicago. Flight 484 is high in the sky in the middle of severe icing conditions, and the flight crew is struggling to maintain control of the aircraft, but the disaster is inevitable. This is the story of American Airlines Flight 484. On the afternoon of October 31st, 1994, American Eagle Flight 4184 was scheduled to operate a short-haul domestic route from Indianapolis International Airport to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The flight was operated by Siemens Airlines on behalf of American Eagle using an ATR-72, a twin-engine turboprop aircraft designed for regional travel. At first glance, this flight seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. The aircraft, a relatively new 7-month-old ATR-72, had been well maintained and had no known mechanical issues before takeoff. The flight crew of American Eagle Flight 4184 consisted of 2 skilled pilots and 2 flight attendants. Captain Orlando Aguiar, aged 29, was an experienced pilot with nearly 8,000 flight hours, including 1,584 hours in the ATR-72. Colleagues spoke highly of his flying abilities and described him as a professional who fostered a calm and relaxed atmosphere in the cockpit. First Officer Jeffrey Galliano, aged 30, had accumulated more than 5,000 flight hours, with 3,657 of them in the ATR-72. His peers considered him a capable and competent pilot. The 2 flight attendants were responsible for passengers' safety and comfort. One of them was on her first day working for American Eagle, adding a bittersweet element to the tragedy that would soon unfold. Flight 4184 was scheduled to depart the gate in Indianapolis at 2:10 p.m. and arrive in Chicago O'Hare International Airport at 3:15 p.m. However, due to worsening weather conditions at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the flight left the gate at 2:14 p.m. and was held on the ground for 42 minutes. At 2:55 p.m., the controller cleared Flight 4184 for takeoff. The flight crew engaged the autopilot as the airplane climbed through 1,800 feet. At 3:05 p.m., the captain made initial radio contact with the Danville sector radar controller and reported that they were at 10,700 feet and climbing to 14,000 feet. At 3:08 p.m., the captain of flight requested and received the clearance to continue the climb to the final en route altitude of 16,000 feet. At 3:09 p.m., the pilots of other airplane provided a pilot report to the DNV controller that there was light icing at 12,000 feet over Lafayette. According to the DNV controller, because the crew of Flight 4184 was on the frequency and had established radio contact, the pilot report was not repeated. At 3:13 p.m., Flight 4184 began its descent to an altitude of 10,000 feet, with First Officer Galliano taking control of the aircraft. During the descent, the flight data recorder noted that the Level 3 airframe de-icing system had been activated. Additionally, the propeller RPM was recorded at 86%, indicating the aircraft was operating within standard parameters. At 3:18 p.m., after Flight 4184 had leveled off at 10,000 feet, the boom controller informed the crew that they were cleared to the Lucid intersection. The controller also provided the holding pattern instructions, telling the crew to expect further clearance at 3:30. The captain acknowledged the transmission, indicating he understood and confirmed the instructions. Approximately 1 minute later, at 3:19 p.m., the boom controller revised the further clearance for Flight 4184 to 3:45 p.m. This was followed by several radio communications between the captain of flight and the boom controller, during which the crew received approval for a 10 nautical mile lag in the holding pattern, a reduction in speed, and confirmation that right turns would be made while holding. At 3:24 p.m., the captain of Flight 4184 contacted the boom controller again, reporting that they were entering the hold. The first holding pattern was flown at approximate speed of 175 knots or 201 miles per hour, with the wing flaps retracted to optimize fuel efficiency and minimize drag. During this time, the airframe de-icing system was deactivated, likely as the aircraft was no longer encountering conditions that require the system to remain active. Additionally, the propeller speed was reduced to 77%, which was consistent with the lower power settings typical for holding patterns. At 3:33 p.m., the captain remarked, "Man, that thing gets a high deck angle in these turns, we are just wallowing in the air right now." Flight data recorder data showed that the aircraft's angle of attack was 5 degrees at the time. In response to the captain's observation, the first officer adjusted the flaps to the 15 degrees position, which helped the aircraft return to level flight. At 3:41 p.m., the cockpit voice recorder recorded the sounds of a single tone similar to the caution alert chime. At the same time, the flight data recorder recorded the activation of the Level 3 airframe de-icing systems. Just 3 seconds later, the flight data recorder showed a corresponding increase in the propeller speed from 77% to 86% in accordance with the requirements for managing the icing conditions. At 3:49 p.m., the captain left the cockpit and went to the rear of the aircraft to use the restroom. He returned at 3:54 and asked the first officer for an update on both company communications and air traffic control interactions. However, the captain did not inquire about current icing conditions or the status of the aircraft de-ice systems. At 3:55 p.m., the first officer remarked, "We still got ice," but the captain did not respond to this comment. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that there were no further discussions between the flight crew regarding the icing conditions after this point. At 3:56 p.m., the flight data recorder showed that the airplane began to descend from 10,000 feet. The engine power was reduced to the flight idle position, the propeller speed was 86%, and the autopilot remained engaged in the vertical speed and hidden select mode. At 3:57 p.m., as the airplane was descending in a 15-degree right wind down altitude at 186 knots, the sound of the flap overspeed warning was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. 5 seconds later, the captain commented, "I knew we would do that." As the flaps began transitioning to the 0-degree position, the angle of attack and pitch altitude began to increase. At 3:57 and 33 seconds p.m., as the airplane was descending through 9,130 feet, the angle of attack increased through 5 degrees, and the ailerons began deflecting to a right wind down position. About half a second later, the ailerons rapidly deflected to 13.43 degrees right wind down, the autopilot disconnected, and the cockpit voice recorder recorded the sounds of the autopilot disconnect warning. The airplane rolled rapidly to the right, and the pitch altitude and angle of attack began to decrease. Within several seconds of the initial aileron and roll excursion, the angle of attack decreased through 3.5 degrees, the ailerons moved to a nearly neutral position, and the airplane stopped rolling at 77 degrees right wind down. The airplane then began to roll to the left toward a wind's level altitude, the elevator began moving in a nose-up direction, the angle of attack began increasing, and the pitch altitude stopped at approximately 15 degrees nose down. 5 seconds later, as the airplane rolled back to the left through 59 degrees right wind down, the angle of attack increased again through 5 degrees, and the ailerons again deflected rapidly to a right wind down position. The captain nose-up control column force exceeded 22 pounds, and the airplane rolled rapidly to the right at a rate in excess of 50 degrees per second, bringing the plane completely inverted. As the airplane rolled through 120 degrees, the captain's nose-up control column force decreased below 22 pounds, and the first officer's nose-up control column force exceeded 22 pounds just after the airplane rolled through the inverted position. Throughout this roll, the data recorder showed that the first officer was sustaining nose-up elevator inputs. After the aircraft completed a full right roll and passed through a wind's level altitude, the captain said, "Alright man," and the first officer's nose-up control column force decreased below 22 pounds. The nose-up elevator and angle of attack then decreased rapidly, the ailerons immediately deflected to 6 degrees left wind down, and then stabilized at about 1 degree right wind down, and the airplane stopped rolling at 144 degrees right wind down, a steep right bank. 15 seconds after the autopilot was disconnected, the airplane began rolling left back towards wind's level. The airspeed increased through 260 knots, the pitch altitude decreased through 60 degrees nose down, acceleration fluctuated between 2.0 and 2.5 g, and altitude decreased through 6,000 feet. At 3:57 and 51 seconds, as the roll altitude passed through 90 degrees, continuing towards wind's levels, the captain applied more than 22 pounds of nose-up control column force, the elevator position increased to about 3 degrees nose up, pitch altitude stopped decreasing at 73 degrees nose down, the airspeed increased through 300 knots, normal acceleration remained about 2 g, and the altitude decreased through 4,900 feet. At 3:57 and 53 seconds, as the captain's nose-up control column force decreased below 22 pounds, the first officer's nose-up control column force again exceeded 22 pounds, and the captain made the statement, "Nice and easy." Just 2 seconds later, the normal acceleration increased to over 3.0 g, the sound of ground proximity warning system alert was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, and the captain's nose-up control column force again exceeded 22 pounds. Approximately 1.7 seconds later, as the altitude decreased through 1,700 feet, the first officer made an expletive comment, the elevator position and the vertical acceleration began to increase rapidly, and the cockpit voice recorder recorded a loud crunching sound. The last recorded data from the flight data recorder occurred at the altitude of 1,682 feet and indicated that the airplane was at an indicated airspeed of 375 knots, a pitch altitude of 38 degrees nose down with 5 degrees of nose-up elevator, and was experiencing a vertical acceleration of 3.6 g. The cockpit voice recorder continued to record the loud crunching sound for an additional 0.4 seconds. The airplane impacted a wet soybean field in Lincoln Township, Newton County, Indiana, partially inverted in a nose-down left wing low altitude. The plane was completely destroyed, leaving no chances for all 68 people on board. The distribution of wreckage, combined with the data from flight recorders, indicated that the horizontal stabilizer and outboard sections of both wings separated from the airplane prior to impact in close proximity to the ground. American Airlines Flight 4184 tragically crashed on October 31, 1994 due to a combination of factors including aircraft icing conditions, crew actions and system malfunctions. The aircraft was caught in severe icing conditions that led to the activation of the airframe de-icing systems, and although the crew managed some of the issues, the plane's aerodynamic performance worsened quickly. The autopilot's disconnection, aileron deflections and the roll excursions demonstrated the complexities of handling an aircraft in such extreme conditions. Despite efforts by the crew to regain control, the aircraft ultimately exceeded its uncontrollable limits, leading to an uncontrollable spiral and the fatal crash. The accident highlights the importance of properly assessing and managing severe weather conditions, particularly icing, as well as the critical need for effective crew communication and coordination in handling unexpected emergencies. In the aftermath, improvements in icing detection, de-icing systems, and pilot training were implemented to enhance safety in similar circumstances. The lessons learned from this flight helped shape aviation safety protocols, underscoring the necessity of thorough situational awareness and the ability to respond quickly to evolving in-flight challenges.